Kudos, willkommen in einem neuen video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 10 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series of videos. In this video I'll be discussing the exploration and colonization of the Sol system, and for those who don't know, Sol is our system. I must note the timeline of the Star Trek TOS universe is not our timeline. Some pivotal event occurred in 1968 or 1969 which caused the timelines to diverge, which I discussed in my previous videos. One effect of this change is the different focus on space travel. In the Star Trek TOS timeline, space exploration and colonization occurs much more than it does in our timeline. The two global conflicts and the appearance of the Vulcans may have been the cause of this. Going through all the objects in our solar system, let's start with the Moon. The only mention of the Moon is in the episode Tomorrow is Yesterday and the episode Return to Tomorrow, and in both cases it's in reference to the first landing on the Moon, no colonization attempt. There is only one mention of Mars in Return to Tomorrow, which was a comment about going to Mars, which I assume is exploration and eventual colonization. Kirk states, "They used to say if man could fly, he'll have wings. But he did fly, he discovered he had to. Do you wish that the first Apollo missions hadn't reached the Moon? Or that we hadn't gone on to Mars and then to the nearest stars?" We do have two comments about Martian colonies, of which there must have been at least three. However, these are colonies established by Mars, which means Mars must have sent out colonists when it was just called Mars and not part of any unified alliance with Earth. Venus is only mentioned once, but it's not the actual planet. Instead, it's a drug called Venus drug. This could mean the drug is named after the goddess Venus, or it could mean it comes from the planet Venus. I suspect the former, which could mean Venus is never terraformed in the TOS timeline. Real shame. Jupiter is never mentioned in the TOS Star Trek scripts, except in the Roman world where it's the name of a car. However, we can assume exploration and exploitation of its moons occurred in the same manner as what probably occurred with Saturn. Saturn is only mentioned once in the episode Tomorrow is in Yesterday, unless of course you have to ignore the Roman world where Saturn is again used as some sort of product name. In this reference, a Earth-Saturn manned mission is discussed. I have assumed this occurred in 2009 using a DY-300 or DY-400 class spacecraft. Could have occurred earlier. There is no mention of Neptune or Uranus, and Pluto is only mentioned as the Enterprise goes past it. There is no mention of the asteroid belt in Sol in the scripts. However, we do know from the episode Operation Annihilate that the Federation does mine asteroid belts and has bases on the asteroids as well, not in the Sol system, but elsewhere. You would assume something similar would occur in the Sol system as well. In order to understand how the Earth explored and colonized the Sol system, we need to take this minimal information and use related events to construct a possible historical theory. As Sherlock Holmes used to say, at least I think he used to say, any theory which fits all known facts can be correct, thus we should start with the simplest one first. Strangely enough, the most significant fact we have is the existence of Martian colonies, at least three. These are probably not colonies on Mars, they are colonies founded by Mars. This means Mars must have been a fully functional independent nation with the ability to send colonists to other star systems. Our history of the Sol system has to ensure Mars is able to achieve this. The earliest date for the exploration of Mars is probably the late 1970s, if the Apollo mission landed on the Moon in 1969 and then sent a succession of follow-on missions during the decade to found a move base. The next challenge may well be a mission to Mars. Remember, in this timeline, the space race almost certainly is continuing, and the linear path we experienced between, up to 1969 is assumed to be continuing. Manned primitive spacecraft could have started going to Mars in 1979 with a similar profile, to the Moon exploration, setting up a base in the late 1980s. This may have allowed the US to set up a small base on Mars before World War III in 1986. World War III would have caused a halt to this plan, but we know the US developed and built the DY-100 during and shortly after World War III, so the delay may not have been that significant. Perhaps there was a ferocious space race with the USSR still occurring, and there was actually a Soviet base on Mars as well. This may have occurred if Korolev didn't die when he had an operation in Moscow, and the Soviet N1 booster was successful as a result. The key to colonise Mars is the development and construction of the DY-100 interplanetary spacecraft in the early 1990s. I'd suggest 1992 or 1994 to allow Khan to modify it and escape in 1996. Mars must be colonised, developed, made independent and able to send colonists to other systems by this date. Thus, the colonisation, development and independence of Mars must have occurred between 1992 and 2049. If the US built a number of DY-100 spacecraft between 1992 and 2000, they could have been able to transport a significant amount of colonists to Mars. Khan's ship could carry 84 people in sleeper pods. With no sleeper pods on board, up to 200 passengers could have been carried. The spacecraft must have been able to travel very quickly, so an Earth-Mars round trip of 3 to 6 months would be very viable. This would allow one ship to transport 400 to 800 colonists per year to Mars. A fleet of 10 DY-100 spacecraft could have allowed a colony of up to 15,000 to be established by the year 2000. This is a bit of a stretch, but possible. By 2018, the population of Mars could have been as great as 200,000, assuming additional DY-100 spacecraft are built and no improvised spacecraft are created. This, of course, can only occur if there's only one target of colonisation, which before FTL Drive, that would be the case, and that target is Mars. So if there's only one target, Earth probably went all out against that particular planet to colonise and terraform it. Based on the episode Space Seed, there was a DY-500 spacecraft mentioned, which was a ship that probably possessed some form of FTL drive and was used for interstellar travel. This is why Kirk initially thought Khan's ship was a DY-500. If correct, the development of the DY-200 to DY-400 occurred before 2018, which means the newest ships could have had much larger capacity. If correct, a population of 500,000 on Mars in 2018 is certainly possible. The development of the DY-500 spacecraft in 2018 provided some form of FTL capability. I would suggest an early form of impulse drive was developed by 2018 and used in the DY-500. The Earth had sent an FTL probe out unmanned in 2002, so the basic concept was known. Observing the Vulcan FTL impulse drive gave the Earth the incentive to develop their own impulse drive. I suspect the Earth had sent early spacecraft to Alpha Centauri before 2018. Perhaps they developed a drive giving them the ability to travel at a relativistic speed, which allowed them to reach Alpha Centauri in possibly 8 to 16 years. In Space Seed, one of the Enterprise crew, Marla, indicated it took years to travel between planets, which would mean systems, before 2018. Once the DY-500 was developed, which was FTL capable, this time was slashed. With FTL drive available in 2018, the Earth could now focus on developing colonies on Alpha Centauri rather than developing Mars, so Mars may have taken a back seat. After all, Mars needed terraforming. While it was easier to get people to Mars, it was more difficult to make Mars habitable. Alpha Centauri may have contained a habitable planet, so all you had to do was get people to Alpha Centauri in order to get your colony to kick off or kickstart or start developing. Now we need to look at the other end of our Mars timeline. Mars had to be able to create colonies before 2049. If they had a number of DY-500 spacecraft, they could have sent ships out in 2039 to found their 3 colonies. I have no idea where these colonies were. It could have been Alpha Centauri or some other system. If Alpha Centauri, they could have easily been able to establish 3 colonies. If further out, the colonies would be much smaller. We know early Federation colonists consisted of about, or early Federation colonies consisted of about 100 to 200 colonists each, plus equipment. A single DY-500 could accommodate this. A single DY-500 could travel to a system 10 light years away 3 times to found a colony within a 10-year time frame. This assumed there are 3 habitable planets in possibly a single system. The pivotal question that we need to ask is, why would Mars be sending out colonists? It does not seem to be very logical, unless they were annoyed about not being the number one colony anymore and they wanted to regain its former glory by founding new colonies. This may also be a critical driver behind independence. A population of well over 1 million in 2039 is viable, so Mars was no longer just a minor backwater and must have possessed some form of economic power. I suspect it was a logical base for any asteroid mining and grew wealthy on that trade. Now we come to the really big elephant in the room concerning this theory. This timeline is only required if Mars was annoyed about taking the number 2 position, or second fiddle to Alpha Centauri, and as a result became independent and found colonies. If Mars never became independent, then the Martian colonies could refer to different colonies on the planet Mars, although it's the only time the TOS script calls different locations on a single planet different colony names. I personally like the Mars becoming independent theory, and I actually believe that probably is the correct TOS timeline. One interesting point that I thought about while creating this video is that Mars may well be the first and last attempt by the Terrans to terraform a planet. When the colonisation of Mars first occurred in the 1980s, it was the best candidate as a second home for humanity. By 2018, that was no longer the case, as FTL Drive now opened up a host of livable planets which could be reached in a reasonable time frame. Mars was no longer as important to Earth, and while I have no doubt the Martians continued their terraforming effort, this was the last planet such an effort would have been made for. Now we come to Colonel Green's War. Colonel Philip Green led a genocidal war in the 21st century. This war occurred sometime between 2000 and, I assume, 2033, so I have guessed 2000. It could have occurred later than 2000, but either way it lasts for only probably 1 year. A world war involving Colonel Green makes no sense. Colonel Green's country would have been reasonably small compared with a united NATO-Warsaw Pact alliance. It would be like Luxembourg invading Germany. As a result, this could not be a world war and was most likely a small country on Earth engaging in a war with another small country on Earth. Green was probably looking for more glory to shore up support in his own country. Some theories suggest he wanted to mutilate people because of the World War III and eugenic wars, nuclear attacks. This could be possible, but I will stay with my simple theory and let others fill in those details. Any war involving Colonel Green would have needed to be short, sharp and involved minimal infrastructure damage. I would suggest the result could have been the formation of the United Earth Territory involving all countries on Earth. The other events in the Solar System are probably not as important, and regardless I don't have much information about them, but it's very logical to assume a reasonably large moon base would exist in 2050. It would have been a good staging point for the Mars colonisation and building of the DY class of spacecraft. I also suspect a great deal of mining would have occurred in the asteroid belt, using Mars as a supply depot. This would have been rather extensive by 2050. We know the US completed the Earth-Saturn probe during a DY-300 or DY-400, I mean the type of spacecraft is a guess, in 2009. If that occurred, then any manned mission to Mars would have occurred earlier, possibly 2007. This could have used an earlier spacecraft, let's say a DY-200 spacecraft. By 2050, I would suspect most of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn would have bases, research and mining bases, for the most part. I don't think people would live in such locations where it was possible to go up to a pristine planet in another system on a nice fast FTL drive. By 2050, the main focus was exploring other systems. The Solar System was probably fully exploited and was being extensively developed. Because there were many pristine worlds in other systems, there would have been few, if any, space habitats. Why bother when you can have a nice, beautiful world to just simply dump 100 to 200 colonists on it, plus equipment, and let them go forth and multiply? The other key event would be the formation of the multi-planet United Earth Territories, which now included Earth and Mars. Possibly Colonel Green was a catalyst for this, or possibly Earth decided it was best if all human forces or planets or colonies in space had some form of supervision by a common political entity. And so we come to an end of part 10 of my Star Trek TOS timeline, in this case covering the exploration and colonisation of the Solar System. The episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.